9 years, until the birth of our third child and our move to York when we needed to retire from that position. With all my love for local lore, it was a delight to read a little about the history of Derry Presbyterian, a remarkable 300-year story so far in the life of your congregation. Although my Presbyterian missionary parents have always modeled for me a lifelong love for Jesus Christ, and although I always felt at home in the church within which I was raised, I ended up moving as an adult into the Orthodox Church, being chrismated at St. John Chrysostom Church in York with my wife and 3 children, when our youngest, now 3 years old, was baptized. Having taken a job with a curriculum publisher, Classical Academic Press, a little closer to Harrisburg again, we now attend Holy Apostles Orthodox Church in Mechanicsburg. To be clear, I'm not remotely qualified to speak for my new church family in any way, and whatever I share today is simply my own personal reflections, although I certainly hope they do reflect some of what I'm learning in the Orthodox Church. There are many ways to approach or describe my thesis this morning. The entire world holds together in God in profound ways. This simple thesis was essential to the ancient Christian understanding of reality. Probably the easiest approach for our modern minds to understand is our physical and biological interdependence. This is only one result of our more substantial connectedness, but it is a good place to start. Contemporary Anglican philosopher Stephen R.L. Clark, in his book God, Religion, and Reality, says, "A human person requires a cosmos to sustain it. Of anyone, it is literally true that the whole world is her body, since the light of the sun and the respiration of algae are essential to her bodily survival." End quote. This claim that our bodies literally depend on the entire universe surrounding us is one way to approach an ancient understanding of the human body and the cosmos as profoundly connected. And this cosmic body must, of course, be a shared body. We modern Americans don't wake up and go about our days as if the entire universe is our body. However, most humans did experience this as a daily reality prior to the Enlightenment. As difficult as the image might be, this vision of a shared cosmic body is important to consider seriously if we want to understand our Bibles, our world, or ourselves. Dale Martin is a New Testament scholar, a preeminent scholar with distinguished careers at Duke and Yale. Without endorsing many specific aspects of his own theology, Martin's scholarship regarding what Paul believed about human bodies is profoundly respected and lines up with many others that I will reference. These passages from his book, The Corinthian Body, provide a quick introduction. Greeks and Romans could see as natural what seems bizarre to us, the non-existence of the individual, the fluidity of the elements that make up the self, and the essential continuity of the human body with its surroundings. In continuing to quote from Dale Martin, "In most of Greco-Roman culture, the human being was a confused commingling of substances, and the human body was of a piece with its environment. The self was a precarious, temporary state of affairs, constituted by forces surrounding and pervading the body, like the radio waves that bounce around and through the bodies of modern urbanites. In such a maelstrom of cosmological forces, the individualism of modern conceptions disappears, and the body is perceived as a location in a continuum of cosmic movement." And one more paragraph from Dale Martin. "No ontological dichotomy between the individual and the social can be located in Paul's logic. One may argue that the modern concept of the individual is simply unavailable to Paul." We're talking obviously here about the Apostle Paul. "In any case, the logic underlying 1 Corinthians 5 depends on the breaking down of any possible boundary between the individual body and the social body." And that's the end of Dale Martin's quotations. To be clear, this understanding of our bodies extends far beyond Paul's world and was actually the norm for most of pre-modern human history. Calvin College philosophy professor James K.A. Smith makes this clear in a passage from his book, How Not to Be Secular, Reading Charles Taylor. His book provides a set of guided notes through the massive work of Charles Taylor called A Secular Age. Smith writes, "The human agent was seen as porous, just as pre-modern nature is always already intermixed with what is beyond, and just as things are intermixed with mind and meaning. So the pre-modern self's porosity means that the self is essentially vulnerable, and hence also healable. To the human, to be especially open to an outside, whether benevolent or malevolent, open to blessing or curse, possession or grace, this sense of vulnerability, Taylor concludes, is one of the principal features which have gone with disenchantment." That's the end quote for Smith's book. He makes the point there that to be human in the pre-modern conception of humanity is essentially to be vulnerable. To turn aside from theologians and philosophers for a moment, we can see that the same points are profoundly unpacked for us by the farmer and poet Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry writes, "The body cannot be whole alone. Persons cannot be whole alone. It is wrong to think that bodily health is compatible with spiritual confusion or cultural disorder or with polluted air or water or with impoverished soil. Intellectually, we know that these patterns of interdependence exist. We understand them better now than perhaps we ever have before. Yet modern social and cultural patterns contradict them and make it difficult or impossible to honor them in practice." Continuing to quote Wendell Berry, "What is the burden of the Bible if not a sense of the mutuality of influence rising out of an essential unity among soul and body and community and world? These are all works of God, and it is therefore the work of virtue to make or restore harmony among them." The last paragraph of Wendell Berry. "The concept of health is rooted in the concept of wholeness. To be healthy is to be whole. The word health belongs to a family of words, a listing of which will suggest how far the consideration of health must carry us: heal, whole, wholesome, hail, hallow, holy." These passages were published by Berry in the year that I was born, 1977. They are his first comprehensive statement of a thesis that he has lived out and defended with stories and prose to this day. As Wendell Berry points out, we know that these patterns of interdependence exist. We understand them better now than perhaps we ever have before. While our modern minds can understand something about ecological networks of mutual dependence extending out into the cosmos and even across time, our body's radical reliance on the world around us, this point actually goes far beyond just our biological life. The ecological approach is only the most accessible way of considering this question. And we have already seen hints of this in the Apostle Paul and in Wendell Berry. These truths must be considered more holistically, and they point toward what is holy. For all ancient people, the material world was understood to be dependent, or even the material world was understood to be dependent on even more substantial realities. Some of these more substantial realities are also fairly easy for our modern minds to grasp, such as the realities of language and light. Two basic realities that J.R.R. Tolkien loved best. Tolkien's use of light and darkness shows a respect for the reality of both and a need to be gentle and modest in our love for the light, so that we can learn to see and to love the light even amid the sometimes gift of darkness. Tolkien was clearly aware of a long tradition regarding the uncreated light of God that Moses saw in the burning bush. In a recent essay for the Front Porch Republic, I described how Wendell Berry, George MacDonald, and Maximus the Confessor all referenced this revelatory power at the burning bush. Picking up on a theme that was already old in his day, Maximus the Confessor writes, "The unspeakable and prodigious fire hidden in the essence of things, as in the bush, is the fire of divine love, and the dazzling brilliance of his beauty inside everything, a shining forth, an epiphany of the mysterious depths of being." To move on to other ways of considering the more substantive realities that connect us all, the most familiar would be mind, spirit, angels, and God. Our problem is that all such categories tend to feel more subjective than substantive to most of us moderns. We very easily think of these realities as functionally irrelevant to daily life, if not outright falsehoods or fantasies that exist only in our mind. Material objects and their components tend to be the only realities that we grant outside of our private imaginings or intellectual abstractions. Even Christians today, and I certainly include myself, tend to live as though the material world is the only reality. Furthermore, among Christians, any talk of spiritual or other realities tends to raise the concern that we are despising matter and the stuff of creation. It is as if the spiritual must either not exist or be a strictly private issue, and as if, among believers, any consideration of the spiritual as real becomes a threat to our respect and appreciation for the material world in which we live. In fact, however, there is a deep and wide heritage of thought that acknowledges and receives our material world with respect and appreciation, while also acknowledging that our material world participates in spiritual realities and ultimately in the life of God, who is the creator and sustainer of all. These schools of contemplative life and metaphysical thought stretch from the Vedic traditions of India to the various pre-Socratic and later Platonic schools of thought in Europe. These contemplatives have insisted that existence itself is a good gift and an inexplicable mystery. Into the midst of this wide accumulation of interrelated contemplative traditions, the Jewish nation comes to be, and the news of God's incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension arrive among us. Early Christian thinkers quickly identified the Neoplatonic school of thought as both their greatest rival and their next most inspired neighbor. In Origin Against Plato, Mark Edwards explains that disagreements between schools of thought in the ancient world were not primarily over ideas, but over allegiance to certain canons or collections of writings and their inspiration. Therefore, many Christians freely made reference to both similarities and differences with various ideas from Neoplatonic thought. But the critical difference for Christians was that these ideas now find their highest life and meaning within the accounts of Jesus Christ and those who followed him. In the end, ideas in isolation made no sense to these ancients. Both Neoplatonism and Christianity were understood most essentially as rival allegiances and ways of life. It was only within these communities of practice that the ideas had any value or validity. With our modern ways of thinking, we tend to focus on the abstract ideas or doctrines as if they are of primary importance, but they were secondary among all the ancient schools of thought. Within the ancient world, the Neoplatonists understood the material world sacramentally. In other words, nature both truly participated in and revealed the life of God. In his book, Ancient Mediterranean Philosophy, Stephen R.L. Clark, who I quoted at the beginning, writes, "Both pagan and Abrahamic Platonists found corporeal nature sacramental. Plotinus was vegetarian. He refused medicines made from animals, and he denounced those Gnostics who despised the earth. Porphyry, his disciple, was until recently the only professional philosopher to write at length in favor of the rights of beasts." End quote. Likewise, the classicist and Christian philosopher David Bentley Hart has said in a recent podcast on the topic of Christianity and Gnosticism that if he had to identify one thing to use in classifying the schools of thoughts as Gnostic, it would be, quote, their lack of any explicit metaphysics of participation, or to state it in reverse, quote, their willingness to amplify a provisional dualism into a complete ontological schism. That is, a separation between evil matter and higher goods. David Bentley Hart here is identifying the Neoplatonists as appreciating material things. Although Neoplatonists initially thought of early Christians as among the despicable Gnostic sects, the early Christians appreciated the sacramental understanding of creation within Neoplatonism, and they widely understood the incarnation of Jesus Christ to be the ultimate expression and guarantee of this sacramental or participatory relationship between creation and the Creator. At the same time, Christian writing that was attempting to push aside the Gnostics who borrowed from their scriptures famously called themselves, that is, the Christians called themselves the true Gnostics. In doing so, however, Christians were separating themselves over principles such as the goodness of creation and its participation in the life of God, principles that were widely recognized from the side of Christians as shared territory with the Neoplatonists. It's not a simple picture, but the boundary lines were clearly maintained over centuries of debate for all of those who were in these competing schools. This more complex picture runs against two different and equally strong tendencies among contemporary Christians. Our first wrong tendency is to lump Platonism, Gnosticism, and early Christianity all together as despising the material world and our bodily lives. This is largely true of the Gnostic sects, but it is not true of either Neoplatonism or Christianity. Early Christians should be understood within a long but consistent process of understanding the truth of the incarnation in terms of the fully revealed glory and goodness of the material world, as this was expounded at the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787, which famously and loudly celebrated the goodness of all material things. All of the exposition of Christian worship and belief at this council took place within cultures that had little reason to think of the material world as good, outside of the powerful declarations within Jewish scriptures and among the Neoplatonists. These two closely shared the ideas involved in understanding the material world as a manifestation of God's glory and beauty. A second common misunderstanding that all of this needs to clear aside is our modern idea that the God of the philosophers is utterly impersonal and incompatible with the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible, who becomes incarnate as Jesus Christ. It is certainly true that the Jewish and Christian God is profoundly personal, embodied, and active within the Jewish scriptures, and that the Christian claims and recognitions of Jesus Christ as God among us and in our flesh was a profound and irrational scandal in the minds of sophisticated and educated people throughout the Roman Empire. However, there was also critical and meaningful points of contact in the world of ideas. These came to have profound significance as the Christian faith spread rapidly across the Hellenized world, proclaiming that Jesus Christ, a Jewish manual laborer and crucified rebel, was also the eternal Logos of God, fully identifiable with God outside of time and inside of time in every aspect of transcendence and immanence. This astounding claim picked up and transformed or fulfilled the highest aspirations of the Neoplatonists, among many others. One of these ancient claims, argues the patristic scholar Andrew Louth in a recent lecture, is that creation is utterly a gift. This idea of creation ex nihilo comes from Greek thinkers as they encountered the Christian faith and entered into it. This ex nihilo concept was not understood by the Neoplatonists in terms of time, primarily, but in terms of existence itself, as a gift in every moment and every instant, regardless of its temporal duration. This insight into creation as a gift given to us by God out of nothingness became the basis for understanding the incarnation among Christians in some of its essential respects, because the eternal Son of the Father and Logos of God, was understood to be a person within the timeless and triune life of God, who was the eternal purpose and template for the entire divine intention and plan with regard to all of creation. You have the Logos as the plan of God, timeless plan of God for all of creation. God's incarnation as Jesus Christ, the first fully human person, was seen as the ultimate purpose of all creation and the essential link between the timeless life of God and the life of all created things. This idea has been developed in many ways by various thinkers, but one of the most famous is Maximus the Confessor. Maximus famously developed the concept of individual logoi as the eternal purpose of every individual thing within God's vast and diverse creation. So every single thing in creation has its own logoi, or purpose. Maximus taught that the logoi of each thing was a direct expression of the eternal logos of God. Summarizing three related teachings within Maximus, contemporary patristic scholar Jordan Wood says the following: Maximus walked the ancient path first tread by Irenaeus. Christ reveals the truth of creation. The truth he sees in the historical incarnation is that everything, all of creation, the entire world, is that word's incarnation. Maximus never qualifies his conviction that the Logos' self-distribution as the logoi is an incarnation of the Word. In his famous and curt explanation of Gregory Nazianzus' remark that the Logos becomes thick, Maximus professes three instances where this is so: the Word's historical incarnation as Jesus Christ, his ineffable self-inscription as the logoi of all creatures, and his consent to be embodied and expressed in language. Christ's incarnation fulfills the entire function and purpose. That's the end of the quote there from Jordan Wood on Maximus the Confessor. Christ's incarnation fulfills the entire function and purpose of all created things in multiple ways. When we begin to grasp the full extent of God's participatory relationship with creation, binding all of his glorious diversity of creation together into a vibrant and living whole, we can start to understand the full meaning of the Greek poet that Paul quotes on the Areopagus in Athens. In him we live and move and have our being, from Acts 17:28. For the Christian Platonist who was writing in the tradition of St. Dionysius the Areopagite, who was there with Paul, God is, this is a quote from St. Dionysius the Areopagite, God is, to speak simply, the life of living things and the being of beings. This typical way of seeing insisted on God's utter transcendence and even unknowability apart from the cosmos, because the life of living things is not any of those lives, and the being of beings is not any of those beings. God is beyond all living things and all beings, which also means that God is not any living thing or any being. These statements about God's transcendence can be misleading, however, because it is the very transcendence of God that makes possible God's radical immanence in our individual lives. God is the only source of existence at the innermost core of every particular thing that exists, and the only source of life at the innermost core of every particular living thing. Only this combination of utter transcendence and radical immanence makes possible our participation in this life and this being that is God, as well as the revelation of God by each thing in the cosmos to all other things. An excellent and thorough technical exposition of all these ideas can be found in Eric Pearl's book, Theophany, the Neoplatonic Philosophy of Dionysius the Areopagite. However, to be clear, these basic concepts are not those of an esoteric minority following the rise of Christianity. They show up everywhere across early Christian writings. In his prayers, Augustin says to God, "You, were more inward to me than my most inward part, and higher than my highest. George MacDonald no doubt had this in mind when he wrote, quote, "The God to whom we pray is nearer to us than the very prayer itself before it leaves the heart." While it is easy to see how such statements could mistakenly be collapsed into modern pantheism, this would be to miss the insistence on a transcendence that all Platonists and Christians most clearly understood as essential to any concept of God as the sustainer of all creation out of nothingness. In brief, pantheism reverses the ontological grounding between God and the cosmos, saying that God exists because of the cosmos, while most ancient sages, even those who held to an eternal cosmos, would have insisted that the cosmos exists because of God, who must be transcendent in order to be immanent. Today's most outspoken and popular advocate of this ancient view is the Christian philosopher David Bentley Hart, who I've already referenced. The most direct survey regarding this ancient understanding of God and the cosmos that I have found is his book, The Experience of God, describing the way in which everything is contingent or dependent on God at the most basic level. Hart takes an illustration from the American philosopher Richard Taylor. I'm going to give an extended quote from David Bentley Hart about this illustration from Richard Taylor. He once illustrated this mystery famously and fetchingly with the image of a man out for a stroll in the forest, unaccountably coming upon a very large translucent sphere. Naturally, he would immediately be taken aback by the sheer strangeness of the thing, and would wonder how it should happen to be there. More to the point, he would certainly never be able to believe that it just happened to be there without any cause or without any possibility of further explanation. The very idea would be absurd. But, adds Taylor, what that man has not noticed is that he might ask the same question equally well about any other thing in the woods, a rock, a tree, no less than this outlandish translucent sphere. He fails to do so only because it rarely occurs to us to interrogate the ontological pedigrees of the things to which we are accustomed. What would provoke our curiosity about the sphere would be that it was so obviously out of place. But as far as existence is concerned, everything is in a sense out of place. As Taylor goes on to say, the question would be no less intelligible or pertinent if we were to imagine that this sphere was either expanded to the size of the entire universe or contracted to the size of a grain of sand, either as existing from everlasting to everlasting or as existing for only a few seconds. It is the sheer and unexpected there-ness of the thing, devoid of any transparent rationale for the fact, that promotes our desire to understand it in terms not simply of its nature, but of its very existence. Each moment of our life and every detail of our existence is fundamentally a direct gift of God. We see the reality of our past and our present only insofar as we can learn to see them as gifts of God and works of God. Moreover, only this vision reveals to us the ultimate connectedness in God that we have with each other and with the rest of creation. Within this shared life and mind of God, we each find a profound common ground. St. Gregory of Nyssa, in his work on the making of man, gives a most developed version of this vision of humanity. All humanity, this is a quote from Nyssa, all humanity is included in the first creation. The entire plenitude of humanity was included by the God of all, by his power and foreknowledge, as it were in one body. And this is what the text teaches us, which says, God created man, and in the image of God created he him. For the image is not in part of our nature, but this power extends equally to all the race. The image of God, which we behold in universal humanity, had its consummation then. He saw, Gregory still speaking of God, God saw how great in number humanity will be in the sum of its individuals. For when the full complement of human nature has reached the limit of the predetermined measure, Paul teaches us that the change in existing things will take place in an instant of time that Paul names a moment and the twinkling of an eye. That's the end of the quote from Gregory of Nyssa. These passages show that Gregory understood the image of God as only being manifested by all of humanity taken together as one body. For God, every single individual was in view from the outset of creation, so that we are all created at once, as it were. Nonetheless, this creation outside of time and within the foreknowledge and life of God takes place for us now, within time, so that we must wait for every individual human to show up within our fallen history before the full image of God is made known, and the transformation of this fallen creation into the new heavens and the new earth can finally take place. With this full number of souls brought to be, God will suddenly roll up all of cosmic time within a moment or a twinkling of an eye, as time is taken into eternity. This understanding of humanity as only being the full image of God when taken as a collective whole is wrapped up with the restoration of all things, taught openly by Gregory of Nyssa as one of the few church fathers who did so. This teaching of radical solidarity across the entire human race is picked up and expounded at some length by David Bentley Hart in his controversial book, That All Shall Be Saved, which uses this concept of Gregory's as part of what is very likely the most dogmatic and demanding case for Christian universalism that the Church has yet to witness. I hope to have suggested that these principles of common ground rest on deep foundations, that they have far-reaching implications, that they show up in many ways of thought. It is really far too vast a topic with too many expressions and corollaries to do more this morning than just provide the most basic survey. Although any additional sharing would go far beyond my limited knowledge, we could look in much more depth at a long list of closely related topics, only some of which I've mentioned in passing this morning. The eternal Logos, the Lamb slain before the foundation of the cosmos in Revelation, Christology, the theory of the Logoi and Maximus the Confessor, God's body as a nexus of powers, the divine essence and energies distinction of St. Gregory Palamas, deep incarnation, sophiology, Mariology, sacramental theology, iconography, the theophany of God at Christ's baptism, the uncreated light of the burning bush, and the transfiguration, and even much more. These ancient ways of thought remained in some forms up through the Protestant Reformation, and they were never entirely erased, even by the Protestant reformers. For example, John Calvin writes in his commentary on Ezekiel, "All creatures are animated by angelic motion, because God exerts and diffuses his energy in a secret manner, so that no creature is content with his own peculiar vigor, but is animated by angels themselves." With these statements, John Calvin is taking for granted the peculiar vigor. He's taking for granted that the peculiar vigor of every human and animal is continually infused with the energy of God himself through the animating power of angels. We no longer think in these mixed and layered categories, but they were commonplace even up through John Calvin's time. In 83 Different Questions, Augustin says that love is a kind of motion and that all motion is towards something. Dante picks up on Augustine and says that love moves the sun and the other stars. C.S. Lewis picks up on Dante, and C.S. Lewis writes that in every sphere there is a rational creature called an intelligence, which is compelled to move and therefore to keep his sphere moving by his incessant desire for God. The motions of the universe are to be conceived not as those of a machine or an army, but rather as a dance, a festival, a symphony, a ritual, a carnival, or all of these in one. End quote for Lewis. Our internal lives are no less mysterious. As Augustine says in his Confessions, men go forth to wonder at the heights of mountains, the huge waves of the sea, the broad flow of the rivers, the extent of the ocean, and the courses of the stars. and we omit to wonder at ourselves. Christian Saint Macarius in the 4th century wrote, "Within the heart are unfathomable depths. It is but a small vessel, and yet dragons and lions are there. There are poisonous creatures and all the treasures of wickedness. Rough, uneven paths are there, and gaping chasms. There likewise is God. There are the angels, there life and the kingdom, there light and the apostles, the heavenly cities and the treasures of grace. All things are there." End quote for St. Macarius describing the human heart. As Lewis says in The Weight of Glory, there is a great deal involved when it comes to human potential. C.S. Lewis, in a famous passage, writes, "It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or another of these destinations. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal." David Bentley Hart writes along these same lines. He says, "In all of us and in all things, there sleeps a fallen God, called by God to awaken and seek union with him as our natural end. To risk a formulation that will offend just about every Christian, but that merely expresses the inescapable conclusion of thinking the theology of divine incarnation and human glorification through to its logical, inevitable terminus." End quote for Hart. We see some of this language also in one source of Gregory Nyssa's vision in the Apostle Paul, from his letter to the Romans. "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." From Romans chapter 8. All of the cosmos is waiting to be born only once the full number of humanity has themselves been spiritually born as the image of God in Jesus Christ. Such grand visions are instructive, but not sustainable, of course. The one simple thread connecting all of this together is the life of contemplative prayer. The single eye of the heart, as Jesus says in Matthew 6:22, can fill the whole body with light. The single eye is the nous, or our intuitive mind. It can guide us when at rest within and in command of our heart. Our chest, as C.S. Lewis calls it in The Abolition of Man. When our heart is not under the tyranny of our analytical mind or head or our passions, our belly. Seeking to see in this way places us into a relationship with the world and the life that it has apart from us. Although because of this independent life, the cosmos is all the more in a real relationship with us. Wendell laments the loss of this relationship with Lady Nature in his essay, The Presence of Nature in the Natural World, A Long Conversation. In this essay, Berry quotes C.S. Lewis, when Lewis says, "Of all the pantheon, Mother Nature has been the hardest to kill." Berry writes, in his own words, later in the essay, "We have lost the old apprehension of nature as a being accessible to imagination, linking heaven and earth, making and informing the incarnate creation, and requiring of humanity an obedience at once worshipful, ethical, and economic. Her stern instruction that we humans have a rightful but responsible place in the order of things has disappeared and has been absent a long time from the working consciousness and our formal schooling." Wendell Berry is pointing out that Nature, when we see the world as a living whole, has a life of its own that must be respected and that instructs us in return, putting us into a true relationship with nature rather than as just an inert reality with no life. Us act with our current place. We must learn to dwell with each other now in the places that we share. In a letter to his friend Arthur Greaves from June 22, 1930, C.S. Lewis once shared this about another friend. Quote, Tolkien once remarked to me that the feeling about home must have been quite different in the days when a family had fed on the produce of the same few miles of country for 6 generations, and that perhaps this is why they saw nymphs in the fountains and dryads in the woods. They were not mistaken, for there was, continuing to quote C.S. Lewis, remembering his friend Tolkien, we of course live on a diet. You may have had Canadian flour, English meat, Scottish oatmeal, African oranges, Australian wine. Today, we are really artificial beings and have no connection, save in sentiment, to any place on earth. We are synthetic men, uprooted. The strength of the hills is not ours. All returning to 6 generations of caring for the same place, we must all learn to see better the beauty and the glory of God in all that is around and within us. We can be intentional about learning to see with our intuitive mind or the single eye of our heart. Then we can recognize from within a heart that is quiet and from within gratitude for our own place and moment, the connections that we have to each other and even to our entire world across space and time. We can find that each human heart is capable of reuniting heaven and earth in each moment of life within the presence of our Creator, who has become forever one of us, even now under this current veil of death. Jesus Christ is the only crucified God, and this crucified God is also our Creator, who reveals the power and beauty that overcomes sin and suffering. Jesus then calls his people to follow him in a task that is difficult for us, but possible in his strength, to gain a quiet and grateful heart that knows how to be connected and in communion with the suffering as well as the glory of our neighbors, our enemies, and our world. I want to share at the end here that I will share a transcript of what I've shared on my blog, copiousflowers.com. You're welcome to see more there with references to the various books. I'll have a list of 12 books that I've referenced here. As a guest here at the church, which belongs to the Presbyterian Church USA, I wanted to give a shout out to to a PCUSA pastor who knows a whole lot more than I do about this whole topic and has read all of these books and more, I'm sure. He's Aaron Berkowitz, and he's a moderator on a very lively social media group, the fans of David Bentley Hart. You can get to know him there, and I recommend him heartily as an authority on these topics and a pastor within the PCUSA. You'd also be very welcome, of course, if you're living in the area, to visit me at any of the churches that I've come to call home over the recent years. I first attended an Orthodox church very close by, Christ the Savior in Harrisburg. It's just not far down the road, and then was chrismated, as I mentioned, at St. Chrysostom in York, and now attend Holy Apostles in Mechanicsburg. Thanks so much for your time.